Hey everybody, welcome back to the wonderful world of Remnant Radio. I've got Andrew Klavan with us, and we're talking about the Kingdom of Cain. It's going to be an exciting program. You guys stay tuned. Hey everybody, thank you so much for jumping back into the program with us. We've got guest Andrew Klavan with us, who's written a phenomenal book on the Kingdom of Cain. We'll give him in a second to kind of describe what that is and unpack that for us. But before we dive into the program, let me remind you, subscribe to the channel, like the video. It helps us in the YouTube algorithms and all that fun stuff. Let me turn it over to my co-host, my partner in crime, Michael Roundtree. How are you doing over there in Oklahoma City?
Doing really well. Beautiful weather here in OKC, and excited about this interview with Andrew Klavan. Josh was talking before the show. It's interesting to just have you on our podcast. We've seen you on the Daily Wire before, but man, excited to talk about this content. And man, you're wrestling with various kind of um, literature and all kinds of just cultural creations and how that interacts with the biblical story and kind of what we learn from all of that. It's going to be a deep thinking podcast, so you guys put on your thinking caps for a little bit. It's going to be really exciting shows. So, Andrew, if you could maybe just introduce us to yourself and a little bit about your book.
Yeah, I'm a as Josh said, have a podcast on the Daily Wire, but I've been a novelist most of my life and write crime stories and mystery stories. They've been made into films and they've been awarded, gotten the Mystery Writers of America awards. But I don't know, about 10, 15 years ago, I began writing not some nonfiction as well, beginning with a memoir about my journey to faith in Christ, and follow that up with a book about the Romantic poets and how they speak to me, how they have changed the way I look at the Gospels. And this book, The Kingdom of Cain, the subtitle is Finding God in the Literature of Darkness, is a study of certain very famous murders that reoccur in the arts. So murders that have movies based on them, novels based on them, works of philosophy. One murderer's hand was mummified and put in a museum. A poet wrote a poem about it. These are murders that have somehow inspired the minds of artists. And I guess my purpose was, for one thing, to answer a question I'm asked enough to be annoying, which is, you call yourself a Christian. How can you write books about such horrible subjects as killing and gangsters and all kinds of bad people? But the other is basically to put forward an idea of the way art transforms reality. So taking something evil like a murder and turning it into something beautiful like the play Macbeth or the movie Psycho, and what that says about our relationship to the spirit and maybe God's relationship to the world. Because I think that the comment by the novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky that beauty will save the world has a lot to it, a lot of truth to it. And so it's basically an exploration of what we see about God in these works of evil that have inspired some beautiful works of art.
You wrote in your book about an encounter you had with a specific atheistic philosopher who, man, just described how all of this comes to nothing. It's all purposeless. It's all meaningless. There's no morality. And you had a kind of grappling, I should say, with that statement to say, wow, my atheism leads to this. Do you think the same is true, likely, of this genre of literature when you're talking about death and murder and this kind of mystery? Do you think that there's something about the objective framing of darkness, as dark as it possibly can be, is actually what causes people to awaken to the fact that there is, in fact, light to be sought? Can you maybe tell a little bit about your own journey there and then unpack that kind of philosophical concept of using darkness as to portray the good, true, and beautiful?
Yeah, what happened to me is I was baptized when I was 49, so I had a lot of time to explore a lot of dead ends and wrong paths. I became a theist, I guess, when I was about 45, and then finally accepted Christ when I was 49. So I had a lot of different phases that I went down, different wrong roads. And one of them, I became an atheist. I had always considered myself as an agnostic. I was a practicing atheist, but I always thought, well, who knows what the truth is. But after a certain series of events that I went through, I just decided that atheism was the only honest answer. And I began reading a lot of atheist philosophers. And I kept noticing that not one of them could answer the question of the moral order, the fact that some things are wrong no matter who says they're right. that some things just cannot be reasoned away, some evils can't be reasoned away. And then I found the Marquis de Sade, who is the man after whom we have named sadism. That's where we get the word sadism. And de Sade was he was a psychopath, but he was also a very intelligent and honest philosopher who said, since there is no God, since I am an atheist, all things are permitted and we should just follow our natures. And in nature, the powerful destroys the weak. And so he was a sadist. He wanted to torture people sometimes to death. And his work consists basically of sadistic pornography interspersed with philosophy. And I read his work and I said, this is the only atheist I've ever read who makes sense. And that is clearly a vision of hell. And I simply cannot accept it. And I stopped on the moment, actually, I stopped in the moment being an atheist. And I went back to being an agnostic, but on a road toward faith. And I think the thing about murder, the thing about cruelty, the thing about evil is it is a dark line in the sand past which it's very difficult to go. I have talked to and interviewed some famous atheist thinkers who, when they get to the subject of evil, will tell you that evil is simply a kind of agreement that we all make. It's relative, it's different in different places, different in different times. But if you listen to them carefully, they don't believe it. I mean, no decent person really believes that. And I myself had that experience, that revelation, when I was about 19 years old. I was in university. The idea of moral relativism was just becoming popular with our intellectual elites, and they were starting to teach it in school. And I read Dostoevsky's great and famous novel, Crime and Punishment, which is about an axe murderer. And Dostoevsky was a believer, he was a Christian, but he was a very, very realistic Christian. He used to study a painting by Holbein, I'm pretty sure it's by Holbein, a painting of Jesus in the grave that is one of the grimmest, most dead pictures you will ever see. It is a picture of a dead man. That's all it is. There's no sign of revelation, of resurrection. And he used to study it so long, stand in front of it, fascinated so long that his wife used to have to come and pull him away from it. And so he did that because he wanted to make sure his faith was justified in the real world, not just in imagination. And he wrote this book about an axe murderer who decides that there's no such thing as God, and therefore he, as a superior human being, has the right to kill somebody, and he kills two women, one of whom is afflicted. She's what we used to call retarded. I think that's the perfect word for what she is. And he kills her with an axe. And I remember sitting at 19 and reading that famous scene and putting the book down and burying my face in my hands, because I realized there was no planet on which that was right. There was no planet, even on a planet of axe murderers, where they all thought it was a great idea. There was no planet where that was not evil. And without my knowing it, that simple revelation turned the ship of my soul in the direction of God. Because once you accept, and you have to accept it on faith, there's no proof of this, but once you accept that this is evil, and there is such a thing as evil and good, you are on the way to belief, whether you like it or not, unless you're dishonest with yourself. And so here's a story about a guy, a great writer, who took a murder. He was inspired by a real life murder in France about a century before that, who was inspired by that murder to write a work of art about murder that touched my heart in such a way that it turned my heart to God, because it showed me that there was some place where philosophy would not go. The fact about philosophy, about reason, is you can reason your way to anything. And it's only if you have somewhat of a healthy soul, somewhat of a healthy spirit, that when you see evil, you recognize it, you can't turn away from it, you can't redefine it. That's the basis of true reason. Then from that point, you can start to reason in a healthy way. But until you start to understand that reason can take apart anything. It can take apart evil and pretend it's good. It can, take apart good and pretend it's evil. It can do anything. Until you have that healthy basis of recognition of the fact that there is a wrong and a right, you can't reason well. And Dostoevsky gave me that gift. And so in my early novels, I would write all these stories about how do you know what's real? How do you know whether something is real or not? But I could never get past that revelation. And ultimately, though it took decades, it led me to God.
Okay. Now that's interesting, because, and you have a certain kind of philosophy on fiction works that it's good and right. to actually address the evil that is in the world and the disgustingness of it. You used an example of that from Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, and I know that in your book you also contrast that with take like Gone with the Wind, or I think the other one was Zone of Interest. And maybe you could just talk to us about why you think it's so important for fiction works not to skirt or somehow beat around the bush when it talks about human evil and all of its capacities. Why is it so important for you as a Christian to want to really explore the depths of human depravity, and how that actually leads you to a good and holy place?
It's a great question. It's one of the reasons I wrote the book, because I look at modern Christian art and I see something that's very shallow, cheerful, safe, and has nothing to do with the world as I understand the world. That wasn't always true of Christian art. In fact, Christian art at its greatest, if you think about the Sistine Chapel, if you think about William Shakespeare, if you think about even some of the masses of Bach and Mozart, is filled, and the requiems is filled with sorrow, suffering. The Gospels are filled with sorrow, suffering. The Bible, the Old Testament, is full of sorrow and suffering. Why? Because God is the God of this world. He's not the God of Never Never Land. People like to quote, is it Ephesians, where he says, meditate on what's true and what's good and what's noble and all that. And I think, well, yeah, if you in fact meditate on what's true, yes, indeed. Maybe that's Philippians. Have I got that right? I'm sorry.
Philippians 4:8. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. But if you concentrate on what's true, that is going to include a great deal that's not noble and that is very dark indeed. If you don't concentrate on what's true, then essentially you're saying that to be a Christian is to be like Peter Pan and never grow up. Think of the happiest things. It's the same as having wings. And I don't believe that at all. The reason I don't believe it is when you come into contact with real life, your faith will shatter. And so I believe that in modern life, where Christianity has kind of gone out of the world, it no longer has the sort of dominant position that it once had in the world. Christians have become very fragile. They're afraid that if they look at something, their faith is going to shatter, their faith is going to break, they're going to become soiled, they're going to become dirty. And I think the opposite is true. I think if through the arts you can experience life as it is, then you have prepared your soul for when you meet the things in life that challenge your faith, in fact, will be much stronger. And so I compare it to romantic comedies. If a woman watches romantic comedies, and that's all she watches. Nothing wrong with romantic comedies, nothing wrong with happy, family-oriented Christian fiction. But if that's all she watches, and she expects that to be some kind of model for her love life is going to be bad. It's going to be misguided. It's going to be fantastical. It's going to fall apart when it hits reality. In the same sense, while there's nothing wrong with watching, God is Not Dead, number 16, if that's what you think faith does for you, you're going to be disappointed in the long run when you have to confront the things we all have to confront, like suffering and death and evil in the world. Whereas if you read a work by a great artist like Crime and Punishment, you're dealing with an axe murderer who, in fact, whose only friend is a prostitute. You will see, even this world, even this broken world in its evil reveals the goodness of God. And that's an amazingly powerful thing to have in your heart. So amazing that even I, an unbelieving Jewish guy immersed in the intellectual culture of my time, which was default atheist, could not resist the journey to God, having seen what Dostoevsky showed me. And look, I think that there are there works of art that are evil. Yeah, I think there are. But I don't think that they're necessarily evil because of the subject matter. They're evil because of the heart of the artist. So I was noting the Marquis de Sade before, which really is pornographic and filthy and ugly. And he was an evil man. And yet it inspired me to good and to seek the good because I recognized evil when I saw it. And so that's the kind of thing that art can teach you. before you reach evil, before you see evil, art can train your soul to know it when you see it. And I think that I take the arts very seriously. I think they're a source of great, great beauty in the world. And I think it's remarkable if you look at a play like Macbeth by William Shakespeare, which is all murder and betrayal and lies and ugliness, you walk away from that play thinking that is a beautiful play. Why is it a beautiful play? It's a beautiful play because it shows you what happens to a man when he violates the moral order. It shows you how meaning goes out of life if you don't attach yourself to the moral order of God. And I think that that's a beautiful thing. You know, that's not necessarily what you see if you actually witness a real murder, which is a shabby, horrible, terrible thing. But when it goes through the transformation of art, I think it can become beautiful. And I think in that beauty is a truth beyond itself.
Tell me a little bit about what your perception is on kind of like the Christian evangelical space. I mean, I find myself in that spot, and I think a lot of what we have made Christianity is a bunch of prescriptive truths, right? Like, hey, do this, do this, do this, do this, check marks. And a lot of even modern preaching comes out of the epistles and not out of narrative text that show a shaping and forming of a story of the life of the people of God and their relationship to God. And you mentioned a moment ago, even our entertainment in many ways is kind of shallow. What is your perception of how that is actually affecting the psyche of those who are in the kind of Christian evangelical space, this kind of bubble or echo chamber that they exist within? Is that as equally as fragile as their storytelling, I suppose, is my question.
Yeah, it is. And it's a really good insight, Josh, in terms of the fact that they're taking their religion from precepts instead of from stories. A story is a living thing. A story is like an experience. It's something, the things that you learn from stories go beyond words. They can't necessarily be broken down into precepts and rules. And I believe that a certain number of precepts and rules are important, but always beyond the precepts, beyond the rules, beyond the rituals, and beyond the orthodoxies is that presence of God, that unspeakable, indescribable presence of God that forms your character into something that seeks the good. And the perfect example of that in the Gospels is the woman taken in adultery, who they want to stone by the law. And if you ask conservatives, and I don't use that politically, but I mean like evangelical conservatives, they will immediately leap to the fact that Jesus says, yes, but he says, sin no more, sin no more. And if you ask liberals, less orthodox believers, they will point to the fact that he says, I do not condemn you. Therefore, God does not condemn adultery, and we have to be, completely accepting of all the things that people do. But what Jesus does is he takes it out of the realm of the describable by addressing it through love, which is not a descriptive thing, not something you can describe. Only stories can convey love from one person to another, aside from, of course, human interaction. Human interaction can convey love. But when you're talking about on the page, you're talking about stories, paintings, music. You're not talking about precept. If I say love your neighbor, that means nothing. I mean, what does that even mean? How can you even know what love is in that situation? But if I show you the love of Christ saying, let him who is without sin throw the first stone, then suddenly something is inside you. You've had an experience that you might not be able to relate, but you can tell that story to others and you can live it out in your life as a story to others. And that's why I just think the arts and literature especially are so important in conveying things, and more important in a lot of ways than the rules. I mean, look, we all need rules to live by. It's a good thing to say, follow the Ten Commandments. Those are wonderful things. But if you watch Jesus carefully, he shatters some of the greatest orthodoxies of his time. And when he shatters the Sabbath, that may not mean what it meant to the Jews of his time. It may no longer mean that. But in his time, he was shattering one of the something that an evangelical of his time would have said, oh my God, this is the most important thing, that we follow the Sabbath. And he said the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And that, to me, suggests that our rituals and our rules and our orthodoxies are means of forming our spirits into the shape of Christ. And that's why I think restricting this kind of stories you read to and I don't want anybody to read stories that are going to disturb them or set them, put them in some evil place. But restricting the stories you read to the happy, the good news, the family oriented, the clean, I think actually strips you of certain power of understanding the world in which you have your faith. And again, like I have my faith in this world, and I've seen, I've been a reporter. I've seen plenty of really unpleasant things and plenty of darkness in human beings. And I think anybody who keeps his eyes open will see darkness in human beings. They haven't damaged my faith at all. They strengthen it. And so I think it really is important that the idea of storytelling. I mean, Jesus told stories. He told parables, and it is an instinct in believers to transform those parables into little lessons in life. And yet they're really very complex, some of them. Some of them can't be transformed into lessons without losing the experience of the story. And I think there's a reason Jesus was a storyteller. You're absolutely right about this. This is the problem. It is looking to the precepts without looking to the stories.
When I was in high school, I was assigned to read Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky, and I remember just going into it like, oh gosh, a long novel. I didn't want to do a summer assigned reading. I didn't want to read over the summer. I wanted to play around. But I ended up being gripped by the story, and it really affected me. And it's a story that explores just the depths of human depravity on one side. I mean, you have this murderer with no moral compass whatsoever. And yet overall, it brings you to a place of beauty and a wider understanding, and kind of makes you think philosophically, etc. So I really resonate with what you're saying, that there is a place for evil within a story to help us understand it in a context that points us to something beautiful and beyond itself. And so I resonate with that. But really, where I want to go with my question is, are there any limits to this inclusion of evil to where it just becomes gratuitous and no longer art? For instance, the pornographers are saying, well, this is art, what I've created, and it's just disgusting pornography. Or violence. You mentioned Macbeth is filled with violence, and yet there's a broader story that makes it good and beautiful. And yet, is there such a thing as just sheer gratuitous violence? In other words, is there some kind of limit or restriction where you would say, yes, we should address evil, and we should even kind of plunge into it, if you will, but there is a line somewhere where it moves from this is art and this is beauty into the place of this is gratuitous. I'm thinking, for instance, like on the pornographic side, for reading 50 Shades of Grey, things like that. Is there a line for you somewhere in how far you think that it's appropriate to dive into the subject of evil?
Yeah, I'm a First Amendment absolutist, believe in free speech, but if they banned pornography, it wouldn't bother me. I don't think it's storytelling. I think it's a toxin. I think it's poison. I guess a funny story. I spent some time writing in Hollywood for my sins, and I have a talent for ghost stories because I love ghost stories, and ghost stories became very popular while I was in Hollywood, and I started writing them. And when you sell a lot of stories, then the companies, the producers, and the studios come to you with their ideas and ask you how you would develop their ideas, and then if they like your take on something, they'll hire you. And I was called in as a ghost story writer because everything in Hollywood goes downward. It goes down to the lowest common denominator. And they said, we want to tell you a story and get your take on it. And I said, okay. And you have to understand, meetings like this can make your year. You can make enough money in a meeting like this to pay for your entire year. Hollywood pays very well. And so they said, here's the story, and we want to know what your take on it is. A woman is captured and she's tortured. And I said, yeah. And they said, that's the story. I started to laugh. I said, guys, I have to explain something to you. When a woman is running across the screen and a murderer is chasing after her, I'm rooting for the woman. Which was like, yeah, well, that's great. Don't let the door hit you on your way out. There was a fad at that time of what was called torture porn. I mean, it wasn't really pornography as we think of it, but the basic plot was a very beautiful woman would come in, she would take off her clothes in some kind of sex scene in the beginning, and then later on she'd be tortured for maybe an hour while the movie played out. And of course, that's disgusting. There's no worth to that at all. There's no redeeming nature to it. I mean, what redeemed the Marquis de Sade for me was not the pornographic scenes; it was the evil that came, floating off the page as a coherent philosophy of atheism. That's what did it. It was the fact that yes, this evil is coherent if you're an atheist, and I think that for all of these things, you actually are just experiencing that evil for the erotic thrill of it. And I don't mean erotic just in a sexual way, but I mean that you are getting excited and somehow gratified by that evil. You have to know. You have to be old enough, first of all. You have to be an adult and know enough when that's happening, because it is possible for there to be. I mean, most sex scenes in movies are gratuitous, almost all of them. I can think of one or two that I would make an exception for. But you have to know when you're being played like that. And you have to say to yourself, you know what, I'm getting out of this. I mean, I can't watch those movies. But while I was in Hollywood, I thought, well, I better look at these because these are very popular. And I watched the first 20 minutes and I thought, no, this is just bathing in acid. This is like, this is a waste of my time. I will never agree to do this. And so what's the point of my knowing about it? But that's something you just have to feel it and you have to know it, because there's no real rule to it. I can imagine an artist taking something that ugly and making it beautiful, but most of the time not. I mean, the thing about the murder scene in Crime and Punishment is, while it is incredibly pitiful and pitiable and breaks your heart and you almost want to turn away as you're reading it, it's not disgusting. It's not exploitative. It's not making you excited by, the axe, buried itself in her head or anything like that. It's just a description of somebody, doing something terrible to himself. And what's so wonderful about the scene is later on when he confesses to this prostitute who's really the only friend he has. What she says to him, and I remember my eyes filling with tears as I read this originally, is she says, "What have you done? What have you done to yourself?" And that's a very brilliant piece of writing. That is a genius piece of writing that shows you that what he has done is not just destroyed these two lives, but he's destroyed his own soul. And I think when you mention Macbeth, that's what you see in Macbeth too. Macbeth ends with one of the greatest nihilistic speeches in all of literature. Life is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. But the message of the play is not nihilistic. The message of the play is that if you separate yourself from the nature of creation, the godly nature of creation, life will lose its meaning. That's a very different thing than somebody writing a play that just says, "Oh, here's some killing because we enjoy it," and then the play is over and it's meaningless. So yes, the short answer to your question is yes. There are certainly exploitative, toxic, disgusting works that can only do you harm.
You framed this whole book over the story of Cain, and so you've titled it like the Kingdom of Cain, and I think that it's an interesting paradigm that if people might miss out on, that this concept of Cain being this victimizer playing the victim the entire time throughout the story is actually a pretty common character trope that keeps coming up in the scriptures. This idea of concealing his sins from God and from others is a consistent theme. I'm even teaching through Zechariah, and we did Zechariah 13 recently, and there's false prophets who they've scarred themselves from performing as false prophets, likely referring to prophets of Baal, and they hide amongst the people of God in order to conceal their sin. And people will ask them, "Hey, where did you get these scars?" And I got them in the house of a friend, or when I was a slave. And they're the victimizers now playing the victim. There's a consistent theme where sin is crouching at the door, trying to conquer Cain, and here's a unclean spirit in these false prophets, literally listed out in Zechariah 13, saying that they're filled with the Spirit. So this kind of idea of this Kingdom of Cain being a kind of meta-narrative throughout the scriptures, kind of repeating itself, I think is an important theme. Can you maybe unpack for us why that story biblically is so important for us today and how it affects modern culture, art, those sorts of things?
Well, I can unpack it a little, because to unpack it completely would probably take the next 30 years, because it's that rich a story. As John Steinbeck has somebody say in his novel East of Eden, which is based on the Cain and Abel story. Somebody says in those, 16 verses? I can't remember. He says in those 16 verses is all of mankind, his entire story of mankind. And I think that's literally true, that it's the first thing that happens after the fall of man. It's the beginning of history. And like many of the traumas of our childhood that we keep repeating, it's repeated throughout history and throughout the history of the Old Testament, where brothers are constantly in tension with each other, constantly battling each other for supremacy. And in every instance, but that one, the younger brother supersedes the older brother. And I think this kind of feeling of envy, that I have been put down, that I have been ill done by, it moves through all of the human heart, and it moves through all of human stories. So I think the thing about the Kingdom of Cain, the thing about the murder of Abel by Cain, is that it contains themes which are in every story. In all the other murders in the book that I study, I can find, here's a movie that's based on that murder. Here's a poem. Here's a novel that's based on that murder. But with Kingdom of Cain, it's in every story. And so what I do instead with that is I break down some of the themes that are involved. And one of them is this theme you put forward as the person who feels that he's been victimized and therefore can victimize others. But another theme is also the sort of the way in which the struggle of good and evil takes place inside of every human heart, because brothers in storytelling almost always represent two faces of a single person. And so that's another idea, the idea of envy, of the sense that your sacrifice, Abel's sacrifice to God, was acceptable and Cain's was not acceptable. And God says to him, if you do well, then you will be acceptable. But instead of turning to himself and fixing himself, he kills the other, the one who has what he doesn't. That is also an incredibly, I mean, is that not a common theme in all of our lives? Why does he get that raise that I wanted? Why does he get that promotion that I wanted? Why does she get this and I don't get it? All of that. I mean, is that not in every human heart? Is not the sense of that God is unfair, that the world is not fair, and therefore I am justified in killing and making it fair? That's one of the themes in my book, in the Kingdom of Cain, that repeats in almost every murderer, that something is wrong with the world that I have to fix, and only I can fix it. And I'm not to trust in God, I have to trust in myself to make it better. The story of Cain and Abel is every man's story at some incredibly deep and kind of horrific level. And that's why I call it the Kingdom of Cain, because I think that we are all living in that kingdom and looking toward the fact that there's another kingdom. There's a kingdom beyond that kingdom that we are trying to move toward through Christ. And I think that at some level, even though to live that story, which we all live, has moments of excruciating pain, there's something very beautiful about that story too. There's something very beautiful, like if we were just all sort of traipsing to heaven and everything was a path of roses. I personally would prefer that much more, but I'm not sure it would contain the depth and beauty and profundity that the story of our lives contain now, when we're living in a world of evil and yet trying to move towards something that we sense is there, that we have faith is there, but we don't quite see. I mean, that makes for a very beautiful and even joyful life, even in the midst of our sorrows. And so I think that some great beauty of design in our lives that art hints at when it takes a murder and turns it into something beautiful that is even more profound than we know. So Cain and Abel, like I could talk about it forever, because I just think it is the history of humankind and it is the nature of humankind spelled out. But I try to get at that in the second part of of this book, in which I start to talk about more beautiful things and things that are the ways in which we live creative lives and answer the evil of the world around us.
Yeah, as a Bible nerd, I just want to tack on to the back of that, because if you look at Eden is supposed to be this walled-in place of worship, right? It's supposed to be this temple here on earth. And then Cain and Abel are removed from said garden through their parents' their sin. Adam and Eve then have Cain and Abel after they've been removed from the garden, and then Cain goes off, and his children produce walled-in cities. And when you follow Cain's genealogies, the people who come from Cain, they invent worship, they invent music, and they are integrating that within their walled-in cities. So you've got this people who are trying to rebuild Eden, and you made the statement that like we're living in this kingdom of Cain, and I think that that's really clear as you see, man, the beginning of the book and the end of the book end in a garden, certainly a city reborn and renewed in some sense at the end of the book, but you have this plumb line of following the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent in some sense, trying to build these counterfeit kingdoms. And it is the kingdoms of Cain, violence and evil and destruction. So I think that's a really good connection. Michael, I'll toss it back over to you.
Yeah, I was actually thinking the same thing just about the title of the book being Kingdom of Cain, and just Cain, the first city in the Bible, is named after Cain's son. Subtle hint at the man-centeredness of city and culture, and the development of technology that follows that. And Josh mentioned some of that. And then you have Lamech, who is the seventh born from Cain. And he's a worse murderer than Cain is. And you see this descent of mankind, culminating in, a few places, but one is the Tower of Babel. And so you see, it's like, Andrew, as you're talking about, there's this power of culture and this beauty within culture and storytelling and all of this. And there's also this ugliness within it, but the Bible doesn't hide from any of it. There's the evil and there's the beauty. But by the end of the story, God's redeemed it all. Even within the story of Cain and Abel, you have the sprinkled blood of Jesus that speaks a better word, not a word of just crying out for justice like Abel's blood cried out for, but Jesus's blood speaks mercy, forgiveness, and reconciliation. So I love the way you've kind of framed that. And I'm thinking too about your chapter on East of Eden, Steinbeck's model, which harkens back to the story of Cain and Abel and kind of elucidates that for us. And one of the quotes you have in your book, I wanted to ask you about. Within chapter 3, you talk about murder as a form of suicide. And I wanted to ask you just maybe if you could expand on that, because I know that, we've talked a lot about murder in these various novels and the important role that it plays in actually displaying beauty when told within a story. But help us understand what you mean by murder as a form of suicide.
Well, I think one of the aspects of love is to realize that another person is in fact a whole other person. I think, in fact, that is the beginning of love, is to realize that you love somebody else because they are somebody else, and yet they sort of become a part of you, and part of their good is your. When I look at my wife, when she suffers, I suffer. When she's happy, I'm happy. We have feelings for each other that put us together. I think murder is the opposite of that. I think murder is looking at another person as a fantasy of something inside yourself that you feel justified in getting rid of. And I think that that's why the first murder is a murder of brothers. It's not a murder of strangers. It's a murder of brothers. And why so often people murder people in real life, people murder the people that they are closest to, their wives, their parents, their children, because they have not differentiated themselves from the other. So if somebody exists in your imagination, you can do all kinds of things. You were talking about porn before. One of the things that porn does in crippling young men is it makes them think that this is the way that women should behave, instead of thinking, oh, this is another person. Maybe she wants to feel tenderness. Maybe she wants to feel kindness. Heaven forbid, she might want to feel some kind of sense of self that you are charmed by and love and are willing to commit to in your love, instead of just thinking, well, you want her in this position because this is the fantasy that you have. And so murder, I think, deprives another person of their humanity, not just physically, but even before the act. I think the murderer has put that person in a fantasy of his own and is killing something within himself. There's a wonderful scene in the movie Silence of the Lambs. It's a little bit in the book, but it's mostly in the movie, where one of the murderers keeps referring to his victim as it in the third person. It wants to do this. It wants to do that. This is a young woman the audience is obviously all with her and is terrified for her and wants her to be rescued, but the murderer just keeps saying, it does this, it does that. And I think that dehumanizing factor is a very accurate depiction of what happens in a murderer's mind, and shows you that murderer is not really thinking that essential thing that underlies the golden rule, that this is another person, this is a whole other universe of experience, a whole other universe of a whole other road to God, a unique road to God that each person represents, and you've lost that. And so what you are doing is look, if you have a fantasy, let's say you have a fantasy in which a man attacks a woman and you rescue the woman, you're every person in that fantasy. You are every person in that fantasy. That's what's called the psychomachy, a psychic battle. And so each one of those characters is just an aspect of your fantasy. You might have aggressive feelings toward women. You might have feelings of vulnerability represented by the woman. And you might have good feelings of wanting to protect the vulnerable that represented in your heroic deeds in your fantasy. When you're in real life, it's very different. Then each person is a complete and utter creation of God, and a complete and utter creation in motion. And to kill that person is a grave sin, not because of who they represent to you, but because of who they really are. So I think that murder is an act of turning another person into your own fantasy, and therefore an act of killing yourself. And that's one of the key themes of Cain and Abel, that murder is a form of suicide.
Mm. Well, I'm reminded of the quote by Augustine, or at least attributed to him, right? Like, all truth is God's truth. And I think that's kind of speaking to what you're talking about when we're talking about good literature, good art, is that it portrays the good, true, and beautiful. And, I'm thinking of this pop culture. You're going to be like, hey, we're talking about real art here, and you're going to bring up Harry Potter, so you can chastise me later. But I think the reason that series was so stinking popular is it kind of ripped off the Christian narrative of good, true, and beautiful. And for my evangelical friends who are watching the program, who are like, dear God, he's watched Harry Potter, please clutch your pearls on another program. Now, all this to say that the main theme of this story is that the kingdom of darkness, if you will, has found some way into the life of Harry. And Harry has to literally die to self to overcome the prince of darkness, if you will. So this whole story is one of goodness, truth, and beauty. And I think that there's a longing for that. There's a desire for that. C.S. Lewis has this quote of like, I don't just want to see beauty. I want to be like overwhelmed by it. I want to partake in it. I want it to be in me and around me and through me. I want to be overcome by beauty. And I think that that's a good godly desire to long for the good, true, and beautiful. But could you maybe frame that in the context of Christian self-sacrifice? Because in one sense, we long for this, we want this, we want to be a part of this. But at the same token, we recognize that there is a self-denial. How do those two things cohabitate?
Yeah, first, I do have to say, by the way, that I think the Harry Potter novels are terrific, and I think they may, in fact, achieve the level of at least art for young adults. And I think and I think the evangelicals were foolish to toss them aside because they were fantasies. I mean, they were fantasies. That's what they are. Nobody was saying that there's real magic here or anything like that. They were just fantasies that, in fact, expressed a very Christly a story, in fact. And what C.S. Lewis said, which was so beautiful. I mean, the guy was one of the great geniuses of the 20th century. What he said was, when he saw beauty, he wanted to go into it. He wanted to enter into it. And this longing, which couldn't be satisfied in life, was a hint to him that there was another world. He said, if you get hungry, there's food. If you want sex, there is, in fact, someone of the opposite sex with whom you can have sex. Every longing that you have has an answer in the real world. And if you long for something that can't be answered in this world, it probably means that you were made for another world, another kingdom, besides the kingdom of Cain. And I think that is right. There is something in beauty that takes you out of yourself. And, the poet John Keats said, beauty is truth, truth, beauty. That's all you know in life and all you need to know. That's what he said. And what I think he meant by that was not prettiness, not like, oh, there's a sunset or a nice flower. What he meant was that deep sense of connection with something outside yourself that is just so overwhelming when you see something that is truly beautiful, not just pretty, but truly beautiful. In the Kingdom of Cain, I write about flying over a cloud cover, a beautiful cloud cover lit by a full moon, and thinking to myself, this was there before there were airplanes, before anybody could see it. This beauty was there waiting for some human being to make it, to say, oh, this is beautiful. And that to me connects you with something. When I saw that, I just felt, you almost feel sorry for atheists. You think, like, how can you be so dumb? How can you miss, what is right in front of you, that beauty? And I'm never afraid of the beautiful. I don't care if it's Harry Potter. I don't care if it's a murder mystery or a horror movie. I was watching the movie Nosferatu, the modern remake of Nosferatu, which is a good movie. It's not a great movie, but cinematically it is spectacularly beautiful. The first 2/3 of it are so beautiful. I just sat in the movie theater thinking, I don't know what this movie's about, but I just love looking at this. This is so beautiful. Yeah. And I think whenever you see beauty, you're being taken out of yourself and connected with something beyond yourself. And that we talk about self-sacrifice, and that's a true description of it, but it's almost like leaving yourself behind. It's not like killing yourself. It's simply letting yourself go. It's letting yourself go into the thing that you are supposed to be. I've done a lot of interviews for this book, hoping people will. I think the people who read this book have loved it so far, which is great, but I'd like to get it to as many people as possible. But I said to my wife the other day, like, I'm so tired of the sound of my own voice. I'm so tired of talking about something that I did, because I just, you don't want to get so involved with yourself because it takes you away from everything that you've been given. And I think that, you call it self-sacrifice, but also just calling it letting go, lose yourself to find yourself, and I think that that's what we're talking about. And that's what beauty does to you if you surrender yourself to it. And I'm never afraid of that. I'm never afraid of the beautiful, even if it's in a story about horror, or witchcraft or whatever it's about. If it's beautiful, I know that it's connecting me to God, and I think that that's a way in which self-sacrifice is a real and truly beautiful thing.
Amen. Amen. Well, we're at about that part of the show where we need to start kind of tying things up. So I'm going to share a closing thought, and then Andrew, I'm going to volley it over to you for you to share maybe your closing thought, what your takeaway is. But I'll get us started here. So as we're talking here about beauty and the power of story, I've been thinking about a quote by Isaac Dinesen. It says, "All suffering is bearable if it is seen as part of a story." And I see this as a lot of what you're talking about. And there's kind of multiple layers to this. For one, in my own life, my own suffering, if I'm only thinking about the suffering that I'm going through, it's hard to see any kind of beauty in that. But every story has ups and downs. If it doesn't, it's not even a story. And so, like you were talking about, just ceaseless torture on one side, even if it was just ceaseless paradise on the other. But stories are full of up and down. And if you can see your story in the context of or your suffering in the context of a broader story written by a God who says in Psalm 139:16, David praying, "All my days are written in your book and planned before a single one of them began." Our lives are part of a story. But even then, only part of a story. You were talking about earlier, the Cain and Abel story is kind of like the story of the whole Bible. And you have these two kinds of kingdoms, in the kingdom of man and the kingdom of God, and they're at conflict with one another. And there's this broad story in everything that starts in perfect harmony with Adam and Eve, and then they go east of Eden, and everything is going downhill from there. And there are all these ups and downs. It's not all downhill, but God is intervening, and he's making covenants with his people, and the prophets are prophesying, and this Christ is going to come, and Christ comes, and he suffers. And that too is just part of the story. It's not like, the gospel just sort of airdrops out of nowhere. It's everything has been heading toward that, and then everything is heading toward the culmination at Christ's return. And so I have the microcosm of my story, and then I have the macrocosm of this greater story of this conflict between two kingdoms, and its ultimate solution at Christ's return when every wrong thing is made right. And it's in that I realize that even in my own story, I'm not the main character. Jesus is, and I'm just a supporting cast. And when I start to see my suffering in light of that, it really helps me see that this is all going somewhere beautiful. And in the end, we're going to all look back and say, wow, that is one beautiful story, the story of Jesus, with billions of different weaving stories of people who've given their lives to him. And I think that really helps put suffering and evil and injustice in its proper context, so that we can more see beauty. And there's a reason why Peter tells us that the angels long to look into these things. The angels that have only lived in paradise wonder what it's like to experience the grace of God and to taste of it, because they haven't needed grace like we've needed grace. And so those are just some of the things that have been kind of rumbling around in my mind as you've been talking. But I've talked enough. Andrew, what are your closing thoughts as we round out this episode?
Well, that was so well put. I hate to follow it, but I think, I do want to say in reaction to that, that one of the first things Christ does in his resurrection on the road to Emmaus is he interprets the story. He shows this was what the story was telling you all along. He looks at the Old Testament scripture in which all of life is contained, everything from marriage to incest to rape and murder and to beauty and to goodness. All of those things are in the Old Testament. And yet he says, yes, now that you understand the story was meant for this. This is what the story was pointing toward. And one of the things that keeps people from faith, especially, I think, thinking people, keeps them from faith. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard this. I'm sure you've heard it a million times too, is I don't believe there can be a God in a world this dark, in a world of such evil. How can there be an all good, all knowing God who allows such evil? And personally, I always find the usual explanations that you hear from Christians. Oh, well, there has to be evil, so there's free will, and there has to be evil because it's part of, we're in a fallen world. All of those things fall flat to me in the actual face of the suffering that evil causes, which is almost suffering beyond belief. And one of the quotes that recurs through the Kingdom of Cain is a quote from another Dostoevsky novel, The Brothers Karamazov, where one of the brothers says that I don't care if there's a God because he can never make up the suffering of a child. If a child has been tortured, if a child has been abused, no heaven can pay back for that suffering. And the Kingdom of Cain ends with a famous statue, the Pietà by Michelangelo, which, if you've ever seen it in real life, is the most beautiful thing any man has ever made. It is a beautiful, beautiful sculpture. But what is it a sculpture of? It's a sculpture of Mary holding the dead body of her son, Jesus. And it's a sculpture of the saddest possible thing that can ever happen. The loss of a child, the death of a child, is probably the saddest thing that can happen to anyone. A mother's loss of a child she loved is probably as sad as anything that happens. But it's more than that. It's also the death of God. It's the crucifixion of God by the world. And so it's not just a single person's sadness, a single person's tragedy. It is also a massacre on a cosmic scale, an evil on a cosmic scale. And yet here you are looking at the greatest evil in human history, the greatest sorrow that any human being can experience. And a human being has taken that moment and sculpted it into something beautiful. And the question I ask at the end of Kingdom of Cain is, if a man can take such a moment and turn it into something beautiful, what can God not do with the world in the vast material of eternity? And I think that when you talk about this being a story, I think that what you have to depend upon is that the story, not that the story is going to be fair, not that it's going to be nice, not that it's going to be sparkly and sunshiny and everything is going to be great, but the story is going to be so fantastically beautiful that it will be justified in and of itself. That when you see it, when you stop seeing it through a glass darkly, but see it face to face, you will say, yes, that was actually worth everything. That was so beautiful, so mind-numbingly, eternally beautiful, that it makes sense of everything. And so that's why I've studied, evil in the arts in this book, and I think that that's why we shouldn't be afraid of seeing evil in the arts, where it becomes beautiful, because I believe that is the story we're being told in our life.
Yeah, I love that. And I'm reminded of Paul at Mars Hill, who's apologetically engaging with his audience. And he quotes a pagan philosopher and he is aware of their mythology concerning the unknown God. And in both of those situations, he is aware of great tragedy, he's aware of great art and poetry, and he uses those as a mechanism to engage with his audience on the good, true, and beautiful, and to point them to what is objective and pointing them upward to what Christ has done for them. So I think your writing here is very timely. It's very appropriate for Christians to be aware of all of these good and godly things and see them as metrics and signposts that point us to Christ, and to the best of our ability, being aware of these things so that we can grapple with the good, true, and beautiful, but also so that we can help culture rightly orient to Christ, I think is invaluable for this season. So thank you for your book. And Andrew, thank you so much for coming on the show. I know we probably kept you longer than we were supposed to. So at that, I'll say thanks for coming on. And guys, thank you for tuning in. Subscribe, hit the like button.